Hey everyone, this is a quick ISO test follow-up to my full review of the Panasonic S5 camera. If you haven't watched it already, I invite you to check it out in the link below. This test will reveal the unpredictable result I got from the dual native ISO in the S5, as well as give you some valuable tips on how to get a clean image even at high ISO setting. So to begin, the first point of this test will cover the dual native ISO performances. To recap, just like the S1H, the S5 is claimed to have dual native ISO that changes depending on the picture profile. I personally use Vlog all the time since it offers the maximum dynamic range, and that's what I use to conduct all my tests here. Unlike the S1H, the dual ISO setting in the S5 will switch between the low and high gain amplifier setting automatically. I assume everyone, including myself, were expecting for both dual native ISOs of 640 and 4000 to have a very similar, if not identical, noise levels. I mean, that's like the whole point of the dual native ISO feature, right? Well, it seems it's not exactly the case here. In APSC mode, ISO 4000 is relatively much noisier than 640. Judging it visually, 4000 looks similar to 1600 actually. I hope that YouTube compression is not destroying this. On full frame, noise levels look a lot better as noise particles are smaller in size. Hold that thought as I'll get back to it shortly. And again, ISO 4000 has a higher noise level than 640. Also visually, it has the same noise levels as 3200, which is the last setting of the low native ISO. Just 1/3 of a stop down or one click away. That's not very promising news, honestly. And this is why you should never take the information from the camera spec sheet at face value and assume it's all good, but rather test things yourself before your shoots to make sure that what you're expecting is in fact what you're getting. With those results, I conducted a new test in a more controlled environment. I digitally mapped and measured the noise levels across all ISO settings and put them in this chart for you, which confirmed a couple of important points. First, full frame performs better than APS-C across all ISO settings. Second, the base high ISO setting of 4000 has higher noise than the base low ISO of 640 across both full frame and APS-C. Keep in mind that computer sees the world in a more clinical way, so I will keep this chart as a reference and still judge things with my own eyes, since they're the ones I trust the most in my shoots. Here's the rundown of what I saw. Visually, the cleanest range you get on both full frame and APS-C is at 640, so as much as you can, try and stick to that setting to get the cleanest image. Then noise creeps slowly reaching 1250. Then from 1600 to 3200, you get low and manageable amount of noise. Then the high gain ISO kicks in at 4000 and resets the noise level around the same range of the 1600 in the low gain ISO, having the same visible low noise amount. Again, it will never match the cleanest performance of the low native ISO of 640 at any point. Then noise gradually gets worse starting from 8000 and all the way up to 51200. That's the range you should avoid whenever possible. Keep in mind that noise is mostly localized in the low midtones and shadow areas. Highlights are usually cleaner and sometimes barely noticeable in the high midtones. So a great tip if you want to avoid noise is to expose to the right, meaning try to save your shadows, bring your subject in the middle gray or closer to the highlights. By all means, don't underexpose it. Let me demonstrate. Here's an ungraded clip shot on Vlog. It's perfectly exposed, nothing is clipping in neither the highlights or the shadows. To prevent any clipping in the highlights, I had to shoot it at -2 stops middle gray. I chose 3200 ISO as an example of a noisy setting just for this demo. Imagine now your subject or talent is supposed to come out of this door. You might think you're already in the clear since your waveform shows nothing is clipping, but when you pixel peep at the door, which lives in the lower midtones and shadows, you'll clearly see noise destroying the details and the colors of the door. While in the higher midtones, where the brick wall is, it's relatively clean. So to prevent noise from coming in the shadows, you'll need to lift your exposure. But in the process, you'll risk clipping the highlights a bit. But that will be for the greater good, which is to save your subject from drowning in noise. So I made the calculated decision to lift the whole exposure by 3 stops and clip the very tips of the highlights, which are not very dominant in this frame anyway. Then brought it down in post to the same level of my original shot that I liked. So far it doesn't look that bad. The highlights I lost are barely noticeable. Now let's check them side by side. Then let's zoom in. As you can see, it's super clean compared to the original shot. It's revealing the real colors and details of the door. You'll be thanking yourself later in post when you start grading on such a clean image. Remember, both clips are shot on the same ISO setting of 3200, the highest ISO value in the low setting. So yeah, just make sure you carefully judge the amount of exposure lift you need to apply with a calculated sacrifice of highlights. This way you could still get away with a very clean image even at very high ISO setting. Now if you're interested, let's quickly check why full frame generally performs better and even look cleaner than APS-C when set at the same ISO value. This is mainly due to the fact that the noise levels in full frame is coming from an oversampled 6K image from the full sensor, while the noise coming from the APS-C mode is coming from the smaller APS-C cropped portion of the sensor, almost 1:1 pixel ratio. So if we take those two areas of the sensor and scale down 6K full frame to match APS-C, aka oversample it, the size of the noise particles in full frame will proportionally shrink in the process and look smaller, hence the finer noise you saw in the test before. Also, full frame technically receives more total amount of light than APS-C due to its bigger physical size of course, giving it another advantage of having a higher noise threshold, which is proven again with this graph. With all that said, don't get me wrong, I would say this camera performed well at high ISO settings. It's not the best performer in the market, not like the Sony a7S III if you're wondering, but good enough to feel confident pushing your ISO to high levels provided you expose properly. I'll try to compare it against other mirrorless cameras to better understand where it stands in the low light performance arena, so stay tuned for that. So to sum up, the best advice for the cleanest results: first, try as much as possible to shoot in full frame, which unfortunately means that your 4K 60 frames will always be noisier. Second, try to stay within the range of 640 and 1250 in the low setting and 4000 and 6400 in the high setting. These ranges have the least amount of noise and they're pretty wide ranges for most types of shoots, I would say. Third is try as much as you can to expose to the right. Keep your subject in the higher midtones whenever possible. It's okay to clip the highlights if they're not important or don't occupy a huge part of your shot. Keep in mind this last point would actually apply to all other cameras out there, not just the S5. With that, I conclude this episode. Hope you found it useful. Don't forget to watch the full S5 review in the link below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.